So you are.
So if you go to the email, it's
I'm in the middle. I'm in the middle here. If I place.
Don't worry. Let's move. We can move that over a little bit. Mike, what's your email?
This is the lecture audience. I'm too cool, so I'm free.
Yeah, well, I didn't see this just too. But I don't think it's asking for the numbers. I think it's asking for
Oh, is it yours? Well, how did I know?
what happens the rent will change.
Yeah. In A, and then goes to. No, the rent will not change.
Yeah, rent will change.
But this one, the rent will be.
Yeah,
I think you're right. I remember.
yeah, but do you look up?
Yes, this one.
That'll be the rent.
Oh, it never ends. There's so many people.
No, it's not before the change. It's like the formula of the money equals 5,000 B for
Okay, good afternoon. So it looks like we still have more than a dozen overflow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, Yeah. I think my understanding is we can kind of let it settle out for about this week, but if, like, by next week we still have, this many extra people coming to class every day, then we have to do something, or the MIT fire marshal is not going to let us continue. So I desperately don't want to not let someone take the class who really wants to take the class. Let me just quickly take a show of hands. How many of you here now are listeners? 2, 3. Don't be shy. Just 3. Okay, everybody else is going to attempt to take it for credit. You realize how hard these exams are going to be. Actually, I should say something in that regard. But I mean, seriously, I do not try to make exams particularly difficult, but there's 4 modules in here, and by far the toughest module, just intellectually, just grasping the material, is the 3rd module, which happens in kind of late October, early November, and we won't have the 2nd quiz until at the end of that 3rd module. The 2nd quiz covers both modules 2 and 3. Well, I don't know how that factors into your decision, but hopefully nobody is really concerned about the grade. We're all really here about the material, learning the stuff. But here's what we can do. I just sent around an email to people, and we have Mike McGrath here is live streaming the class. Hello out there in TV land. I don't know which camera is the one, but so if we get a situation, what we can do is, if you come to the class, and all the seats are already taken, you can go right across the hall here. On the other side of the hallway is the Center for Real Estate conference room. It's a glass-walled conference room. You can sit in there. There's room for probably at least a dozen. There's easily room for all the overflow in there. And you open up your laptop, and the class will be streamed live. Furthermore, you can even plug in one laptop, and it will stream onto a big screen. There's a screen kind of almost this big that will roll down over there. We can show you how to do it. And so it would actually be, everybody in the conference room over there could be focusing on that screen. And of course, you still have your individual laptops. And there's a chat feature which you can live type in questions. And we're going to engage a 3rd TA, which allows me to introduce Mehul Chavada. Mehul is a member of the MSRED class of 2014, working on his thesis this semester. And he's going to add to our stellar crack all-star team of TAs, including Bernardo and Zach. Zach's out of town today. So we'll have then 3 TAs. So one of the TAs will be designated to receive these live questions from across the hall, and perhaps with a little bit of filtering, raise his hand to pose the questions here in class. So it's almost the same as if you're in class. And then the lecture is recorded there, and anybody, of course, in the class can review it at your leisure. So I think this is a great technological extension of the traditional classroom, and I think it's going to enable me to not cut anybody who really doesn't want to be cut. In terms of exams, we'll have, we'll just have multiple proctors or something. We can have multiple locations where the exam happens. So now, one thing I'm going to have to do is the MSRED students, the first-year MSRED students. This is a required core course for you guys. And we're going to block off, I think there's 29 students in that group. We're going to block off a contiguous set of 29 seats, like right in the center here. And those are going to be reserved for the MSRED students because they all not only need to be able to, but we require them to attend every class. So in here in the classroom. So, but other than that, it'd be kind of first come, first serve for getting a seat in here. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you guys end up preferring to be across the hallway there. You can have like side conversations going on and stuff like that. So, but one crucial thing about it is on Mondays, that conference room is reserved for exactly 5:30 for a seminar series for the MSRED students. And it's a seminar series in which we bring in industry speakers from outside, and we've got to have that room cleared and looking in good shape immediately at 5:30. So, you know, leave the space like the way you found it, and clear out by 5:30 from across the hallway there. But by that time, we'll be finishing here, and you know, we can you know, sort of gather after class or something here. But any questions about any of this? Yeah, I'm on them.
So with that solution, anyone that wants to take the class for credit will be able to take for credit?
I think so. Let me, yeah, I haven't gotten like a full final like approval from, I'm not even sure who I have to get the approval from, but I'm virtually sure that I can sign you guys in. Are you one of the ones that? Yeah, and apparently not completely, but anyway. Okay, so with that, we will look at today's lecture. So let's step back a minute and think about where we're at here. We have this Walden Woods case, which we're using as sort of food for thought to you know, munch on. What was kind of the bottom line we were saying last week, qualitatively, about what that business strategy might have been on the part of this very astute real estate investor, Ed Lindy, who made this investment that admittedly we see in retrospect it turned out badly as an investment. But what was that strategy? Yeah.
Sort of front run the expansion out past the highway there,
Right.
and then use the option value of the undeveloped land, sort of the playing card to wait till it's feasibly
Right.
time to develop.
Like a surfer, you know, and he sees the wave coming, and he's out there far enough, soon enough, and he starts paddling the surfboard to catch that wave. He's trying to catch a wave. So that is the essence. This kind of dynamism, the way cities, the way metropolitan areas change dynamically through time, and the way the highest and best use of a given location, a given site, can change, sometimes pretty suddenly or quickly, is how you can make the really big bucks in real estate development, and sometimes even just in real estate investment, right? And so that's kind of the big picture of what we're focusing on here. It's part of it anyway. I guess if I had to step back and say, what are the two main things I'm trying to teach in this Module 1, the urban economics part of the course? One of it is exactly that, the dynamism of urban areas and what that means in terms of opportunities for developers and investors, but also in terms of sort of traps or things that can, you know, not work out. The other part of it is there some sort of urban myths, or what we, no pun intended. There's some things that people just automatically assume about real estate, and they get picked up in the conventional wisdom, and they're used out there in the real world in the numbers that you see out there, the pro forma numbers, and the conversations and the decision making. They're just wrong. They have to be wrong, and once you see the urban economics, you realize that they're wrong. And an example, which is more for next class than this class, is the role of depreciation. The fact that the structures, a large part of the value of the property is the structure, not the land. And structures depreciate. These are wasting assets. So values typically do not keep up with inflation, at least not in a land-rich country like the U.S. So these are you know, the types of, you know, two main sort of things about from the urban economics module of the class, to understand this basic about dynamics, and to explode some urban myths or whatever that are fundamental to understanding the basics of real estate investment. So in that spirit, we have the homework that was for today, and it's still focusing on the simple monocentric model of Chapter 4, the featureless plane, and you know, everybody commutes to a single point, and so forth. And the thing that I set up for you is not specifically about the Walden case, but broadly it's the same type of thing, only with a twist to it here. So the stock market loves growth more than income. You know, when you invest in stock, you get your return on your investment in two ways. Growth in the stock price, the capital gain, and the dividends that the stock pays out, the income. And it's the two together that give you your total return. But it turns out people that invest in the stock market, they seem to like growth, the capital gain, more than they like the income, the dividends, because stocks that provide a lot of growth and relatively little or no dividends sell at a premium, other things being equal, and stocks that don't provide much growth and they provide a really good solid dividend all the time sell at a discount. So apparently the stock market is the land of growth, it loves growth. And so therefore, since you are a REIT and you're traded in the stock market, you got to play in that field. So you're going to try to do your real estate investments that are going to have a lot of growth. So how are you going to do that? There's several ways to do it, but at a fundamental level, if you can pick investments that are in locations that are going to have this sort of pop in location value, then that's one way to do it. And here we have this interesting type of city. It's a new kind of city. Relative to the classical American 20th century metropolis. It's a city of, people of your generation, and you guys, you don't like to commute, so you can do it on a bicycle, right? And so effectively your transport costs are very high, whether it's the inconvenience cost, you just don't like to spend the time in a car or something, or whether it's the gasoline costs are going way up or something, because we're talking about 20 years in the future here. This is a long-term strategic question. And so this city has a new technology economic base. Its population is booming. It's going to go from 1 million to 1.5 million residents. Density is going to increase from 2 to 2.5 people per acre, while the transport cost per person is doubling in real terms. Now the question is, can you get this 3% target by investing in this city, and if so, where? In the center or on the edge? Now we know that back there in 1980-something, Ed Lundy was trying to, maybe his strategy was to get a pop like this out at the edge. But that's not necessarily where these things have to happen, right? Cities are different, they can grow and change in different ways. Now we're in the 21st century. So, and we're going to ask this really in a simplistic way, and one of the questions that was recently posted on the forum asked this. I think Pinchwan, where's Pinchwan? All right, Pinchwan made the very good point that we're dealing with really two things here. Yes, there may be some growth in location value here, but also there's going to be growth in the capital, the structure per acre, because we're increasing the density, and I said, let's assume everybody still wants the same amount of house per person. So instead of 2 houses per acre, we're going to have 2.5 houses per acre. So that's going to require some capital investment to increase the construction, the structure there. But we're going to sort of abstract away from all that. This is really a more big picture, 30,000 foot kind of question. And we just want to see, relatively speaking, the total property asset value, which of course includes the land and the structure. Is it going to grow fast enough to meet this target? And if so, where? So that's the question. And I provided an Excel template, and lo and behold, I actually already filled it out with the answers. That C was supposed to be blank. You were supposed to fill that in by, but that's really pretty straightforward, right? If anybody has any questions about how it's filled in, please post those questions to the forum. So do we have a random student generator here? Is that possible? Yeah. Random student generator. Not working.
Oh, yeah. Stephen Weiss.
Stephen Weiss, is Stephen here?
Yeah.
All right. You do have the option of passing. We always provide that option. But would you like to tell us about this?
Sure. I'll give it a shot.
All right. Is that with a V or a PH?
Steve is fine.
All right.
So we're in a situation where the density is obviously increasing to 2.5.
Right.
So we're also going to see that the rent curve is going to steepen out.
Okay, and so the rent, you mean the rent gradient?
Right.
And that rent gradient is, how's it related to the density?
As density increases, it gets steeper.
Right, but it's, in particular, it's density times what?
Density times transportation costs.
Right, transportation cost per person. So not only are we increasing the density by 25% from 2 to 2.5, but also what's happening to transport cost?
They're going up.
Doubling. So on both of those factors, it's multiplicative. We're going to be increasing the rent gradient, right? So from 2 times 250, $500 per mile rent gradient, to 2.5 times 500, a $1,250 per mile rent gradient. So the rent gradient is going to be more than doubling, right? Okay, so Steve says rent gradient. Oops, sorry. Right, and then, so how's that getting us to solving our problem here, our question?
So, I mean, I basically went through your spreadsheet, right?
Yeah,
You know, if it's.
but you weren't supposed to just look at the answer at the bottom. It's how you get there. So we got a rent gradient that's getting steeper, but what else is going on? The population is increasing from 1 million to 1.5 million.
Right. Income's not changing.
Right, holding everything else constant.
Right.
But if the population is going to be now 1.5 million, and the density's only increasing by, so the population's increasing by 50%, but the density's only increasing 25%, right, from 2 to 2.5. Therefore, what's going to happen to the radius? Because remember, the radius is really important.
Right. Same space.
The radius is crucial in the monocentric model. So the radius is going to get bigger. Not by much, because the radius is a square root function. So if you increase the area by 10%, you only increase the radius by like 5%. But nevertheless, we are increasing the area. It's going to be 1.5 million divided by 2.5 instead of 1 million divided by 2. Something like that in terms of number of acres, right? And so, so we have a steeper rent gradient, and we have radius farther moves the boundary farther out. Now, what are the 2 points in space that you need to consider here? Why don't we go to the next random student generated, Bernardo?
On Martel.
Anne Martel?
Yeah.
Yeah, Anne.
So you're looking at, do you build, Berkeley, or do you build in the center of the city?
Right.
So when you do the calculations, you get 1.67% at an expansion rate at the
Well, how do we get, so what's going on there? So you're saying that, so run those numbers by me again?
So you have the density increasing, but the millennials prefer to live closer.
Yeah.
And so you do see some expansion at the edge of the city, but not enough to kind of justify 3% return that the market wants.
Okay, well, by periphery, we have 2 peripheries, right? We've got, this was the first city, and then it expanded a bit. So, but the investment question up front at time 0, Boston Properties or whatever, they're facing the smaller original city, and they're trying to decide, should we invest here or should we invest here, or either or both, in order to get the 3% growth target. And so if they invest here, how does the value of that site change? We'll still let Anne have one more shot at it.
So it does increase, but not enough as compared to the.
And what makes it increase?
So there is population growth, and so as it moves outward, it gets closer, so the transportation costs still raise.
Right. So there's population growth, and although there's some density increase, there's not as much population growth, so the edge does move out beyond it, which means this point, which was at the very edge and having no location premium, now it's going to have some location premium. So it's going to increase in value for that. Now it's also going to increase in value because we're going to build more structure on it. We're going to have 2.5 houses on there. And the combination of those two things is going to cause this property to be more valuable than it was 20 years previously. 20 years in the future, it's going to be more valuable because of greater location value, because it's now in from a boundary, and it's in from a boundary and at a rent gradient that now is a steeper rent gradient than it was before. But also it's got some more structure on it. For both those reasons, this is going to go up in value, and you plug in the numbers and you see how much it goes up in value, and it turns out it goes up in value by, so 1.67%, let's just call it 1.7% per year for 20 years. So this has got some serious growth to it, but not the 3% that the stock market loves. So what's happening in the center here? Is it Ada? Did you want to answer that? What's happening in the center?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, well, I was thinking about the previous question, that
Okay.
If we go to a threshold that we go 4 miles from the center, we still have a return that is satisfactory.
You're leaving it all the
Yeah.
way to, okay. But before we
And
go
the
there,
prices will grow in the city center.
yeah, and in the center, the value is going to increase for the same reason, but just more so. So it's getting, the outer boundary is what determines it. It's always anchored on the outer boundary, and the outer boundary isn't any further from the center than it is from the periphery. So, but we have all that much more distance that we're going to have this now steeper rent gradient to build location premium for us. So what's primarily driving this is the steeper rent gradient. And what's primarily driving the steeper rent gradient is the doubling of the transport cost per person. That results in this center point, the total property value increasing at a rate of...
3.2.
Oh, okay. Wow. And then what about in the center?
3.21.
3 point what?
21%.
Right, okay. So that's going to be good enough for the stock market. I'm being very simplistic here, right? And the numbers are pulled out of the air. It's just to make the point, right? And then Ada is saying that you actually check to see where's the cutoff point beyond which you will make that 3.00 threshold, and you say it's 4 miles from the center?
Yeah. But this is not accounting for inflation.
Well, this is not accounting for a lot of things. This is a very simplistic question, but it's to make an essential point, which I think is a valid point, that you do get differential growth rates from investments at different locations in a city, and it certainly can be that the greater growth rate will be at the periphery. And it usually was in the 20th century. Maybe still is in a lot of cities in the U.S. But it can also be the opposite. You can also get greater growth in the center than in the periphery. And the conditions I've posed here that you see result in that are conditions relating to the steepness of the rent gradient and the changes in density such that you have a change basically, if the boundary doesn't move out too far, and if the rent gradient moves up enough, then you'll get bigger growth in the center than at the edge. Versus if the boundary's moving out a lot and the rent gradient is not moving up much, or even the rent gradient could be declining, then you'll get your greater growth in the periphery. So think about what determines these things. The rent gradient is transportation cost per person per year. It's not really per person per mile. It's per person per mile, per year, because if you're commuting the same distance, but you only have to commute 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week, you're saving a lot of transport cost. And that could happen because of technology that's not directly transportation technology, it's communication and media technology. So that's the basic point. So any questions? Yeah.
I have two questions. One is something you just said, which was the point on the boundary. I had been thinking of it as having those houses, but they don't have any location premium.
Right.
But is it actually a vacant lot? I guess on one side of that boundary are houses without any location premium. On the other side is a vacant lot. So if you
Right.
the one on this side, the first they have the houses, and so that
Yeah.
construction is.
Yes, that's the basic idea. Is that I'm going to sort of repeat the question partly because we actually already have one remote participant. It's an executive MBA student from Sloan who's actually in Washington. Feedback from him as to how this streaming is working, and he's saying that sometimes I should repeat the questions because the audio works pretty good here, but not necessarily back there. So if I can summarize your question, it's based at the very boundary of the city. There's no location premium in the value of the property. That's correct with the classical monocentric model.
But you just have to be careful because on one side there's houses already.
Yes. Keep in mind that at this point we've been talking about rents, not asset values. So rents are the stream of cash flow that's happening per year. It's like spot rents and not long-term leases or anything. So at the boundary, the rent is just to pay for the construction cost and the agricultural opportunity cost. Just beyond the boundary, the rent's just to pay the agricultural, it's just the agricultural rent because there's no structure there and there's no leasing going on. So it's that sharp and sudden when you're talking about the spot rents. Now, when we get into Chapter 5, we already started to talk about this last class, when we look at asset values rather than spot rents, we're looking at the present value of the projected future rents. And there, yes, the land values, even just beyond the urban boundary, so there's no structure on there. But those land values will already be growing to reflect the fact that pretty soon, if the boundary keeps expanding, we're going to be able to not only put a structure on there, but we're going to be able to start to have some location premiums as the boundary goes even beyond us. We start being able to charge for that. So that's a expected growth component of the land value beyond the boundary of the city. And then there's also this irreversibility premium that we talked about. I did introduce that last class, right? Where because of the uncertainty, because of the volatility in the real estate market, and the fact that you can take advantage of upside possibilities by building into the upmarket, but you don't have to be exposed to the downside possibilities. You just don't develop. If the market goes down, you just wait. That means that because of the volatility, the fact that the market can go up and down, there's actually a value in that option, and that option value is part of the land value, just beyond that expanding boundary. And so that's another reason why the land value is going to go up out there. And in that case, the developer is going to need an extra premium in the rent that they can charge, which is going to just trigger it and make it profitable to do the development, because they have to be compensated for giving up that option. So questions or thoughts about that?
My second question, on the rent gradient, I got a little bit confused during the calculations because it's transportation cost per mile and then it's density per acre. And so I'm just curious if that's going to remain true to that definition that you use per acre over here and per mile.
Yeah, because you have to sort of keep straight in your head what you're talking. The question is, is there an inconsistency between the transportation cost being per mile and the density being per acre? So the rent gradient is a rent gradient in value of rent per acre, and as a function of miles in from the boundary. So we need both of those dimensions there, miles, and it's transportation cost per mile per person, and then density persons per acre. So you multiply the two together, and you get the amount of transportation cost savings per acre of closeness to them. So, okay. So, I think we'll say that by the way, this is what I filled in last year. Pretty much the same answer. Here was a diagram that one of the students last year drew, just to show very explicitly what's going on. The boundaries moving out, and these are actually the cell addresses in the Excel template. The boundaries moving out from the boundary that was computed in cell B6 to the boundary that's computed in cell C6 between the original city and the new city. And the rent gradient is, this C11 slope here. It's computed in cell C11, and that's the new rent gradient. And the increment in value is, this is starting from this $10,000 level here, which is 2 structures. Going out here, we've got 2.5 structures, so we got 12,500 of structure value. And then for this increment of radius, we're moving up at the new rent gradient, bringing us to this value here, which is the new value of the peripheral point, which I forget what it was, at 13,000 something. Okay, so make sure that you do understand each of these computations. Okay.
I had a question about the growth rate. How do you calculate that?
So growth rate, it's just simple compound annual growth rate. You take the ratio of the ending value divided by the beginning value, raise that to the power of the inverse of the number of periods between, subtract out 1. It's just the, if you just do compound growth, you start out with the present value, you grow it at a certain rate, so take 1 plus that rate, multiply it times that, take 1 plus that rate, raise it to the power of the number of periods, because it's compound growth, right? After 2 periods, let's say it's 5% growth rate, so after 2 periods you have 1.05 times 1.05, right? Because you get growth on growth. After 3 periods you have 1.05 times 1.05 times 1.05, so you see it's 1.05 cubed. So 1 plus the growth rate raised to the power of the number of periods that it's growing, compounding, times what you started out with, is going to be what you end up with at the end. So the basic formula, this is in your calculators. This is some of the present value math that TAs have been working with you guys on in the recitation. But if we just invert this formula to solve it for the growth rate, then we just end up with the growth rate is the future value divided by the present value raised to 1 divided by n minus 1. Okay, so that's just a very standard formula. Okay, yes?
Just very quickly, I just didn't know if you would comment on the selection of the growth rate for transportation costs, for instance, because obviously the rent rate is very sensitive to that. So if you start,
Right.
If you don't double it, you only go up to $450 a month or a year.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden the calculations of 3% become
Right.
not achievable.
The question is the sensitivity of these kinds of results to the input parameters. That's the point. That's why it's that's the beauty and the simplicity of this model. It allows you to play around with these basic parameters and see how the results change from them. As to what's the correct way to, what's the correct future transportation cost? Very good question. That's a lot of the uncertainty that causes the volatility that we were talking about that can actually give value to the land option. There's a huge amount of uncertainty regarding what real transportation costs will be, 20 years from now. Okay, so I mean, we do have like transportation experts and transportation courses here at MIT, people like Professor Zegras, Jinhua Zhao, and so forth. But if they're telling you that they really know what it's going to be, they're not going to tell you that. Okay. So I did some playing around with this, and I plugged in numbers that I thought might be more typical of the 20th century in the U.S., in which cities tended to reduce their density as time passed rather than increase their density. But a lot of cities did grow quite a bit in population. So here I had the rapid population growth, but I actually reduced the density. And now look what happens. I think everything else I kept it the same. What's that?
You lowered your transportation cost too.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because that was also definitely going on in the 20th century. So we reduced density, reduced transportation costs, just the opposite of what we do in Tech City. But this is more typical of what was going on in most cities in the 20th century in the U.S. And you, of course, get the exact opposite kind of result. Well, first of all, we don't get the 3% number in either place, at the periphery or the center. But at the periphery, we do get a little bit of positive growth. But at the center, we actually get negative growth. It actually goes down. So you can see what happens there. And notice that we get a little bit of growth at the old periphery, even though we're including the structure value here, and there's less structure value. So we're starting from a lower level there. But and even though the rent gradient is declining, the movement out in the radius is great enough with this reduction in density and this very substantial increase in population, so that we actually get a slight increase in value at the original periphery point. This is an example of how easy it is for the central rent to decline. So all I've done here is, here I've kept population constant, and all I've done is reduce the density, right? Keep transport costs constant, population constant, but I reduce the density. And even though we get the radius moving out, that's not enough to overcome the decline in the rent gradient. And that's a mathematical property that will always be the case. If you hold population constant, transport cost constant, and you reduce density, you will reduce in absolute level the central rent. You can prove that to yourself mathematically, or it has to do with the formula for the area of a circle, right? And so I think it's actually the proof is actually in a footnote in the textbook. So it's relatively easy for central location values to decline, unless you've got really substantial population growth or increase in transport costs per person per year.
Or if people actually, with their increased disposable income, want to buy in the center.
Yeah, so that's a kind of a separate question, is sort of consumer preferences for different, well, I mean, we're already accounting for the preference for central location by the transport cost number here. So I mean, in some sense, you might be saying that actually some people have a really steep rent grade, have a really high transport cost, and yeah, that's going to get into this making this model more complicated, which we do want to get into today. But there's a separate question which I thought you might have been getting at, which is some people might actually like density. There might be actually a preference for density. Other people might actually dislike density, and they might pay for lack of density. And this is a question of personal taste, and it's going to vary from one household to another. But it also tends to vary culturally from one country to another, or from one region to another. Different cultures seem to have different preferences for low or high density living. And also, I think it changes from generation, over time. That's a kind of a separate issue. Here it is another example of how easy it is for the central rent to decline. Here I'm keeping population constant and density constant, and I'm simply reducing transport costs, which sort of technology is always tending to push down transport costs. The countervailing force is income, because to some extent, often to a considerable extent, transport cost, the transport cost that matters in urban areas is the value of people's time. It's how much people will pay to get out of having to spend another 10 minutes commuting. And their ability and their desire and ability to pay for that increases as their real incomes increase. So if you have growing real incomes per capita, you can have increases in transport cost per capita, even though the technology of the transport is actually tending to bring the costs down. So there's this, countervailing forces there. But here again, we have a result of no change at the periphery because we're keeping population and density constant, so the periphery is staying the same, and an absolute reduction in central rents. So let's get into making the model more complicated, more subtle, more complete, able to take into consideration some additional features of real-world cities so that we can further explore this question of where can there be opportunities and or sort of traps or urban myths facing developers and real estate investors. And the first obvious thing is that unlike in the simple monocentric model, in the real world, we have more than one land use and more than one density, and that can make the city way more rich and complex. And we have, of course, different types of land uses, include commercial, and there's different kinds of commercial uses, retail, office, etc. There's industrial uses, residential uses, and there's densities that we can build. So how does this shake out? In the real world, you get things like this. This looks like Chicago. This does not look like, the monocentric city, even though everybody always says, well, Chicago is on a featureless plain. The Illinois, the plains, the prairies of Illinois they're all flat, the same. Granted, there's Lake Michigan on one half, but what does that do? That just simply, remember that slices our monocentric city in half, so it has to be bigger, but it's still a perfect, half circle on a featureless plain. But even Chicago doesn't exactly look like that. Here's Atlanta from Google satellite view. Atlanta, if ever there's a city that has a 360-degree arc around which it can build in any direction, and really plenty of land in all these directions, quite buildable. There's some topography there, but there's not very many swamps. The glaciers never went down that far. It's not very good agricultural land. So if ever there's a city that can expand in all directions, it's Atlanta. And again, this does not look uniform like that monocentric city model. So in particular, what we're seeing most strikingly in Atlanta or Chicago is a variation in density. And in particular, of course, we see the high density at the center. The question is why? What determines these different uses and densities? And here's the fundamental reason. And this is actually a repeat. This exhibit in Chapter 5 is so important that it got repeated in two chapters. First introduced this back at the beginning of Chapter 4 with this idea of a bid rent function. The different land uses, meaning, and a land use means a type of and a density of use. And the density means sort of the FAR, the floor area ratio. It means how much building per acre of land. And so here we've got three different land uses, and they have three different characteristic bid rent functions. And land use A is very productive per acre of land in the right location. Okay, it can produce more profit, or the people that are using it are willing and able to pay more rent per acre than any other use if they are in the place where they want to be. But as they move further away from that place, their ability to pay rent, the productivity of that use falls rapidly. In other words, a very steep rent gradient for that bid rent function. Now, and then, at the other extreme, we have use C out here that, yes, it also would prefer to be at that same central point. It's going to be more productive. People would rather be at that central point. They will pay a higher amount to be at that central point, but there's not that much inherent productivity per acre in that land use. So they just can't afford to pay that much more rent to be at the center. But on the other hand, as they move out, there's not as much of a penalty per mile as they move farther out in their ability to pay or that use's ability to produce on whatever location they're on. Okay, in the middle we have a use B that's in between. So what's going to determine, there's two things going on here. There's the sort of the peak ability to pay when you're at your favorite location, your best location. And then there's how that ability to pay declines as you have to move further away from that location. What's going to determine those two things? Yeah. Okay, but think about what's going to be on the land, what's going to enable whatever it is to be on the land to be able to pay more, to be able to have more productivity, if indeed that site is the best site for it. Yeah.
It's about transportation. If the transportation is very good and connect to other city.
Okay, that's what's going to make the central point the central point. But what is it that enables use A to be able to pay more at that central point than use B or use C? Yeah.
Is it zoning?
Zoning?
Yeah.
This is above and beyond zoning. Zoning can come into play as an overlay, but this is just pure laissez-faire market.
It can produce more revenue at that site.
It can produce more revenue per acre at that site. What enables buildings to produce more revenue per acre?
People are willing to pay more for location.
They're willing to pay more, but why?
Because they have a higher transportation cost.
Okay, so let's suppose that the people are all willing to pay the same amount per acre. Then what would make them able to bid a higher price for if they're characterizing use A than use B? Let me go to Felipe. I'm sorry?
Those uses need no interaction with things and to be in the same place.
Yeah, agglomeration effects, that's nice, but it's something more simple and more fundamental than that. And I'll take, what, Josh?
Productivity?
Yeah, but physically, in real estate, what makes productivity on land?
Density.
Okay, it's even simpler than that. It's how many people are there per acre that can bid. Let's say each person can bid $100. If there's going to be 10 people on the acre, that's $1,000. If there's only 5 people on the acre, there's only $500. So the density itself enables that top point to be higher, right? The density of the usage of the land. How's that get reflected in buildings? More buildings per acre, higher buildings per acre, a higher FAR, higher floor area ratio. Denser construction, denser physical capital per area of land inevitably, inherently makes a more productive thing. If it's on a location that it likes. I mean, we're assuming this is the location that everybody likes the best. Okay, so this could be as simple as use A is high-rise apartments and use C is low-rise garden apartments. It could be as simple as that. Now, it can be a lot more rich than that. It could be use A is Class A office buildings that rent out to lawyers and headquarters, and Class C is I don't know.
Industrial.
Yeah, warehouses. But you see the basic point that it's the intensity of the built structures on the land that make for the maximum point of the bid function. And therefore, you're going to have skyscrapers at the center and not on the periphery. Now, why couldn't we maybe have skyscrapers everywhere? If skyscrapers are more productive and they can bid higher, then let's have them everywhere. Well, then we have the shape of this bid rent slope, right? The rent gradient is the transport cost per acre times the density, right? Or times the distance. And so we've got a steeper, if this is dense, if this is like, the 10 people per acre, then it's 10 people who are experiencing the greater transport cost of being a mile away instead of the 5 people who are experiencing the greater transport cost. Therefore, twice as much reduction of ability to pay. Right? So the same thing that makes the peak point higher also makes the rent gradient steeper. All right. Now there can be other factors as well, but it's simple, and that you can get this kind of result with as simple as that. So inevitably, you're going to get these, the greater physical capital at the central location. Skyscrapers are going to be at the center, and the single-family homes are going to be out at the edges. And this is simply a reflection of fundamental economic efficiency, which is to use this scarce resource more efficiently, right? And central points are scarcer than non-central points. If I draw this, we have the circle here. How many points are in this circle? I can make, depending on how small I make my points, I can make an infinite number of points in this circle. How many points are in the center of the circle? 1. Right? That 1 point is closest, on average, to all the other points in the circle than any other point in the circle. That's pretty intuitive, right? At this point, on average, the average distance from this point is closer than the average distance from any other point, because, yes, this point is closer to these points out here than this point is, but look how far you have to go over here to get to this point. And if you total that all up, it's another fundamental sort of mathematical geometric property. There's only one distance minimizing point in any two-dimensional space. And at least in any, what do you call it, contiguous, convex space. So the fundamentals of urban density and why this can matter to real estate investors is, first of all, to understand the types of uses that can be most profitable at a given place, but also how this can change over time. So, fundamentally, we saw the importance of this boundary with the monocentric city. We saw how it was influencing maybe the decision of an Ed Lendy in the Walden case. Well, there's actually 3 boundaries here, right? There's the boundary between use A and B, the boundary between, I guess there's 2 boundaries, no, there's 3. The boundary between use B and C, and finally the outer boundary between use C and the non-urban use out there. So it's as though we have 3 monocentric cities inside each other. And each of these has a boundary of a higher and denser and more productive use. And if any one of these boundaries is expanding, then there's going to be opportunities like what we talked about at the edge of the monocentric city. And in fact, that's probably what Ed Lendy's dealing with, right? The outer boundary of single-family housing usage for Boston was probably way out here. I don't know, maybe Route 495. And maybe this is Route 128 here. And this was maybe, at least for a particular area, a boundary of a higher density, higher productive use than single-family housing that was maybe expanded. So Lendy was trying to catch one of these inner boundaries as it was moving out. Everybody see that? Questions? Okay. This leads to a classical model of urban form. This is called the Burgess concentric ring model. It goes back to the 1920s. Geography professor at University of Chicago. There was this Chicago School of Urban Geography that flourished in the 1920s and 30s. And maybe it was partly because Chicago was like on this featureless plain. Or maybe the idea of a featureless plain came from these guys that were living in Chicago. The thing about this model is obviously it derives a lot from this fundamental paradigm here. But it's more than that, because it considers the different types of usages, not just the different densities, and it considers the dynamics, how the city changes over time, how the history of the city's development actually affects the current and future development and opportunities in the city. Because this was a like I say, he was a geographer, not an economist, which means he was like liberated from economists they're very rigorous, but they're also a bit narrow. They have a discipline. They have to stick within this discipline. The discipline has to do with markets and equilibrium, right? Competition and equilibrium. But a geographer is kind of free. They don't have to necessarily prove their theorems, based on economic axioms and so forth. So he's bringing in sort of the history, and one of the things that is involved is, there's a big question that they were trying to answer, because they were noticing as American cities, as American metropolises were developing in the 20th century, already was becoming obvious by the 1920s, you had this phenomenon where higher income residences were farther from the central point than the lower income residences. Not always, but as a general rule. And doesn't that kind of seem to violate this? If the higher income people, what we were talking about that Fani was making earlier, that the richer people, their value of time is greater, and they're more able to pay to save 10 minutes of commuting time. So they should have a steeper, effectively they have higher transport cost, they have a steeper bid rent function, they have higher productivity, they're earning all their high income, so they should be able to outbid, and they should live in the center. It should be the center where the high income residences are. And in fact, we do see this in a lot of cities in the world. It is kind of the traditional model of cities. The richer people live in the center, and the poorer people live in the outer parts. But this was not what was happening in American cities already by the early 20th century. And so part of this model is to explain that, and part of that is in consumer preferences, and part of it is in history of how the city develops, the actual path that to get to the present. So how can we explain this? Matt.
It's largely governed by the tastes of people who value, say, there's racism, so they value the security of being away from whites, value the security of being away from
Okay, there could be racism, but we're going to leave that out because we don't need it to explain this. And already, I mean, in the 1920s, there weren't the Great Migration hadn't really happened yet, and I don't know there was that much of an issue in the 1920s. So it's not really, I mean, it's not so much that, or it doesn't have to be that. It's simply a preference for density, right, or lack of density. If rich people enough want low density living, then they'll want they'll want to live where they can have low density living, right? And that interacts with the history of the development of the city. And the city starts out at the center and it develops outward. So in the closer rings here, you've already got buildings. It was already built up with structures at a time when the density was greater. Either maybe rich people didn't have as much preference for having big lawns, or they didn't have as much ability to afford it, or the transportation technology was different, so you really needed to have the density. For whatever reason, there's already a lot of structures in here, and you could tear them down and replace them with low density housing with big yards, but that would be hugely costly because you have the opportunity cost of all those structures you're tearing down, and they still have some value, a lot of value. So that alone, the preference for low density housing, will put the high income people out here, right? Yeah, Paul.
I would add to that I think density might contribute a one-dimensional sort of component of this, in that also through time people demand more space in their housing traditionally. I think we've sort of like hit like post-peak like McMansion, like we don't want 4,000 square foot homes anymore, but traditionally people would live in like 500 square foot apartments in the city center, and as you become more wealthy, you demand more space, and to get that larger housing.
Well, but there's two separate, there's the size of the structure, and then there's the size of the land, or there's the floor area ratio or whatever.
I'm just saying like people were also demanding more living space, and that was more easily achieved at the periphery of.
I guess it's sort of two things. It's the density of the living, the preferred living environment in terms of open space, yard, private or whatever. But it's also the newness of the structure. We want a structure that's new, that therefore its design conforms to our current tastes, which could include issues about the size of the unit. So for both of those reasons, newness and low density, that's going to put them out on the periphery. And so what you have is that although they have maybe a high cost of transportation, the density is low enough. Remember, the rent gradient is cost of transportation times density. So if the density is low enough, then the rent gradient is going to be low, even though the transport cost per person is high. And so that's what put these rich people out there at the periphery. Not entirely. There's always some rich people who wanted to stay in the center, and they did. There's plush areas in central Chicago and New York and other places. Boston always had Beacon Hill and Back Bay. But overall, on average, this is what happened in U.S. cities. It's a bit of a unique phenomenon. I don't think this has happened as much in a lot of other countries, although it does happen to some extent in the UK and Canada and, I don't know, maybe Australia. But any other countries where this phenomenon is particularly noteworthy, where high-income people tend to live further out?
Taipei.
Where?
Taipei.
Taipei, really? Interesting.
In India, it varies between the cities. In cities like Bombay, in India, it varies between the cities. Some of the cities are more.
So which cities in India would have high-income people further out?
Like Hyderabad in the south.
Hyderabad?
Bangalore. There are a few.
Bangalore?
Yeah. Whereas in Bombay, people, as they get richer, they want to go move closer to.
Is this because in Bombay the transport system is such that if you don't live in the center, you're not going to get there? Yeah. Whereas in Hyderabad and Bangalore, you can move enough that you can live in the edge and stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So you see this Burgess model, yeah.
I have a question. I mean, if even with the same distance from the center, the people with higher income, their transportation cost is possibly lower, right?
Well, yeah, their sensitivity to travel time may be higher, but maybe they can avail themselves of different modes of transport that are quicker or more pleasant. So there's also the technological issue of different modes of transportation and how they're available to different people with different costs and so forth. So that's another element of complexity that comes into play. Yeah.
So is that another reason why they tend to live further?
I think it's part of it, because when by the 1920s you already had the automobile was becoming a major means of transport in the U.S. and pretty good paved roads were starting to exist. It really became an issue after World War II when the federal government started building expressways in the cities and to connect the suburbs to the cities, and it definitely played a role then. And that's another difference in the U.S. A lot of other countries have not really built so much urban expressways, like right into the cities. They tend to have interurban expressways, but once you get very close into the city, there'll be some sort of beltway or something, but they won't bring the expressway right into the center of the city. So, okay, this is what we've just been talking about. Yeah. And this is coming back to the point that I introduced on last Wednesday about what goes on with land values just beyond an expanding boundary. And the point is, now you see there's more than one boundary here. And so expansion can be happening or not happening at various points in various boundaries. And that's with the concentric ring model. But we have an alternative model. This is Homer Hoyt. Homer Hoyt was another professor at University of Chicago, same time as Burgess. What was Burgess' first name? Anyway, Homer Hoyt actually is even more famous than Burgess, at least in real estate circles. He did this incredible piece of research. It's called 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago. And so he's writing in like 1930 or so. And he's going back and he's tracing land values all around Chicago from the very beginning of Chicago, which is like 1830 or something. And so it's an incredible data set, an incredible piece of research, a very famous article, foundational article. But he was so fascinated by land values, he began speculating it in land himself. He became incredibly wealthy. He was very successful. So this is an academic who put his theories into practice and really made a bundle from it. And then, just before he died, there was also a very entrepreneurial academic by the name of Professor Maurice Selden. I think he was at American University in Washington, D.C. Not really top tier, okay, academically speaking. But this guy was very entrepreneurial. He was a real fan of Homer Hoyt. And he got to know Homer Hoyt. This is being recorded, huh? I have to be careful what I say. But the point is, he got Homer Hoyt to bequeath a chunk of his fortune to set up an institute called the Homer Hoyt Institute, and to be located in Florida, on the ocean, and Palm Beach, and to fund real estate academic research, teaching, and so forth. So, with of course Maurice Selden as the head of the Homer Hoyt Institute. But in any case, so this is just it's a bit of an aside. You know, a bunch of real estate academics once or twice a year they go to Palm Beach, Florida, to the Homer Hoyt Institute. They have seminars and so forth, all because of Homer Hoyt making so much money in his land speculation. So his idea, his model was diametrically opposite the Burgess model. He said, concentric rings, you're crazy. It's not that at all. It goes out in these radial sectors he called them, from the center. And so the city starts out as a very tight, dense sort of like nucleus, which everything's all mixed together in the period of time before there was any mechanized transport. It was all like within a square mile or so. But even there, in that nucleus, there would be, on one side where everybody had to get every place by walking, there would be sort of one type of activity clustered kind of here and another here and so forth. And then as the city expanded, whatever was there, it stayed on that side. So if, let's say, the west side of town was the ritzy good address, that was the rich side of town, then as the city expanded, that continued to be the rich side. And so forth. So the nature of the uses is more radial than concentric. And he also brought in some environmental theory of this, maybe one of the first ones ever. But he noticed that it does seem to happen in a lot of American cities that the upper income side was the side from which the winds blow. And there was a lot of heavy industry and so forth. And so, I mean, for example, if the winds were coming from the east, then, and the heavy industry was in the east, then you probably would not have the upper income in the west downwind from the heavy industry. So there's that. There's also amenities like a lakeshore. If the lakeshore is valued by the high income, then they're going to continue to, like Chicago's an obvious case, right? The northern sector of the lakeshore coming out from the center of Chicago has always used to be high income. You go right up that shore of the lake from downtown Chicago, you go north, it's always good neighborhoods practically all the way up. So so that's the Hoyt sector model. So what do you think? Which of the two models is correct? How many people will vote for the sector model? Just think of Boston. You got Beacon Hill was on kind of the west side of the nucleus, the core of original Boston, and then they built out Back Bay. They filled in the land, and Back Bay was just to the west of Beacon. And Back Bay became the greatest place to live. And then just west of that is Brookline, and then Newton, and then Weston and Wellesley. You know, the highest income per capita towns in Massachusetts, some of the highest in the whole country, are on that west, going from Beacon Hill. And so, how many people are going to vote for the sector model? Okay, how many people vote for the concentric ring? We're getting more for the sector.
Can it be a mix?
Well, that's the whole thing. I think, next slide? No. It's they're both true, all right? They both have truth in them. And every city's going to be a combination of sectors and rings. So, keep that in mind. And they both have indications for the dynamics of how land using highest and best uses are changing, and therefore for what's going to be happening to your real estate investment over the medium to long-term future. Okay, we still haven't changed the fact that we've just been looking at one center, but the reality is cities have more than one center. So there is typically a major center, a most central center, a most important center, which in the parlance of urban economists is called, at least in the U.S., is called Central Business District, CBD, the downtown. But there are other lower hierarchy commercial centers, neighborhood business districts. There are things called MACs, major activity centers. So something like, well, I've got some lists there. You know, if you have an airport, if you have a major hospital, you know, you'll have that's a major center, right, for certain types of uses and activities. There's this phenomenon that happened in the latter part of the 20th century called edge cities, where you started out typically with a shopping mall, and it blossomed into having some offices and some apartments, and pretty soon you've got a complex that is as big as a traditional CBD in terms of total square footage, total employment, and in some cities, some of these edge cities are actually bigger than their CBDs and have higher rents per square foot. I think in Atlanta, for example, a couple of the edge cities to the north have the peak rent per square foot, at least in terms of office rent, for the entire metropolitan area. In the U.S., these would typically happen where you have a circumferential beltway, and you have these radial interstate highways that are going in towards the center of the city, where the interstate highway crosses the beltway is a great location to have an edge city. And and then there's these sort of original polynuclear cities that never just had one center. You know, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Los Angeles. I mean, there is a downtown Los Angeles, but it's always been like a constellation of a number of towns in Los Angeles County and Orange County, and then you've got these clusters like the Ruhr in Germany, which is about a half a dozen major cities, and they're just all clustered there along the Ruhr River and the Rhine River, and they're close enough that the constellation of the Ruhr is itself no bigger than, you know, I mean, I think the population of the Ruhr, the urban population is maybe 8 or 10 million, and the size of it is no bigger than, say, London or Paris, which is a single city of 8 or 10 million. So it's like a London or a Paris, but it's not one single city. It's a whole cluster of Essen and Dortmund and anybody from Germany? Düsseldorf, yeah, lots of major German cities. This is when you look at the rent gradient, the transept of the land rents of a polynuclear city, you get something like this. There might be a peak, and it might indeed be at the CBD, the original center, the central center, but you're going to get these local peaks that are reflecting these other types of subcenters. And there's usually in a metropolitan area, there's usually a bit of a hierarchy, and there usually is one major center. The exceptions would be places like the Ruhr, where, you know, the Ruhr doesn't have a single center. Okay, so there's a picture of an edge city there. This is Tyson's Corner. Notice that they build high-rise in edge cities often, even though they're out far enough from the center that land values per acre were not necessarily that high. They didn't really necessarily have to go high from a purely economic perspective. Yeah.
That's a question on that last graph, when you show the different centers and how they interact.
Right.
Why wouldn't those lines be additive? Why are, like, the additional right you gain from being near a major activity center and the proximity to the center?
Because remember, the value of each site is what the maximum bidder will bid for it.
Okay.
So.
All right. So it's
Yeah.
They're offset.
Last point for today is neighborhood succession theory. So take a neighborhood or a district within a city and think about what happens to that over time. And I mean, the first thing that happens to it is it gets urbanized in the first place, right? And previously it was agricultural, or it was wilderness land beyond there, and something happened that the boundary of the expanding city came to that point, and suddenly the land is more valuable because you can do urban uses with it, and so that's a pop in land value, or the value of the highest and best use of that site. And so then maybe it's built out as a single-family neighborhood, let's say, and it basically reaches a maturity because the land is all built out. It can stay like that indefinitely. Easily it can stay like that for decades or centuries. But because, as we've said, cities are very dynamic places. They expand, they change in their economic bases, sub-centers develop, technology changes, and the thing can go either way. I mean, it can also stay the same. But it may be that one of these central higher productivity, higher value uses expands or develops close enough to this site that it becomes possible to redevelop this district or this neighborhood to a higher, more productive use. Maybe this is going from single-family homes to multifamily homes. Maybe this is going from middle-income housing to upper-income housing. Maybe this is going from residential to commercial. But it means another pop in the land value per acre and in the highest and best use. Alternatively, it can go down. We've seen how land values can go down even in central locations as transportation costs change and whatnot. And you can get spiral effects where you get disinvestment in the structures that are there, and the neighborhood gets a stigma to it and whatnot. So the thing can go down. It can stay there indefinitely in a low value use, or it can rejuvenate, right? And there's been, and that's a hallmark of mature, successful cities, is that they constantly keep rejuvenating their neighborhoods. Famous examples, are in New York, places like Greenwich Village and Soho, and now it's over in Brooklyn and places. But what about, or even up in Harlem? What about in Boston? Where's an area in Boston right now that's really bouncing up that previously was lower value? South End. Actually, South End I think is already that happened already a decade or two ago. Slummerville, right? It used to be called Somerville, and now it's like the hot place where everybody wants to live and work and play. So, and you got people used to say, triple deckers, these really boring houses, and it gets really hot in the summer on the top floor and cold in the winter and all that stuff. But now, triple deckers, wow, this unique kind of building, and Somerville's full of triple deckers. And so, like in Chicago, the bungalows, right? These simple houses, prairie-style houses they built in the 1920s, and now some of those neighborhoods are rejuvenating, and that style of architecture is really great. So that's a wonderful dynamic thing about cities, and as a investor, real estate investor, or even more as a developer, you want to find those points, and maybe you can even influence or trigger it to happen to some extent. So how many people are taking or have taken Professor Frenchman's Introduction to Urban Design and Development, 11301? So that course is a lot about this, right? You guys know in more depth than we could It's not what this course is about specifically, but that underlies those sort of physical, economic, social considerations that Professor Frenchman teaches about underlie these kinds of evolutions. We have a beautiful real-world specific example of this. It's hard to get actual quantitative empirical measurements of this thing because you need such a long period of history. But in the Netherlands, Professor Piet Eickholt is one of the co-authors in our book. Doing his PhD dissertation, this book there that has all of everything about every property on this canal in Amsterdam ever since the canal was built in 1628. And so we're able to create an index of the property values on that canal for over 300 years. And what you basically see from this, so this is controlling for inflation. So these are real values. And this is not controlling for capital improvement expenditures. So it's basically the same buildings because they never really changed the buildings, the external facades anyway, but plenty of improvements and upkeep of the buildings. And we're not subtracting that out. So this is like the value of the highest and best use as an index, changing over time. And basically there's this initial pop here, which corresponds to this point here, where it went from agricultural to urban. And then there's ups and downs, and these correspond. You can look at the history of the Netherlands, and these correspond to, there was like plagues and wars here with the British, and the British won, and it was a tulip mania here, and it crashed. And then it was good times in the 18th century until French Revolution, and Napoleon invaded and conquered and everything, and until like the middle of the 19th century began the Industrial Revolution. But the point is, it's basically cycling around. It's not an upward trend in real terms until the 20th century, and that would be equivalent to a second pop here. And that's by that time, this canal, which is about a half a mile, it's like a circumferential canal. So it's really like a Burgess concentric ring. And it was always been a prestige address. Herengracht literally means the gentleman's canal. And Herengracht means canal. And I'm very proud of my ability to pronounce Dutch. So, do we have a Dutch person in here?
No, but my husband's Dutch.
That's right. Did I do it right?
Fine, yeah.
Herengracht. Okay, so it's a half mile from the original center of Amsterdam, and for all that period of time, that was a distance from the center that made the highest and best use residential. High-class residential, but residential, until the 20th century, by which time Amsterdam has expanded so much, and the transport technology has changed to the point where now the CBD of Amsterdam, the commercial center of Amsterdam, the boundary of that has actually reached the Herengracht. And to a change in highest and best use from residential to commercial. And then it kind of stopped because they put regulations and they don't allow any buildings to be converted and so forth. But here's a picture of it. There's the beautiful Herengracht, or this is the actual Gracht here. If you look at this in numbers, what you see is that in real value, for over 300 years, the average annual increase is barely more than 0.5% per year. And this includes the effect of the capital expenditures that are made on these structures. If you took that out, then probably the increase in capital value would be zero or negative in real terms. So that is food for thought, considering that the Netherlands has been a pretty economically successful country pretty consistently. Amsterdam has been a very successful and prosperous city pretty consistently, and this has been a top address in Amsterdam pretty consistently for 4 centuries. So, and if that's the best you can do, then I will leave that thought hanging for the next class, because that's when we're going to talk about depreciation and sort of the long run expected growth that you can have in real estate. So, thank you.